If you're like many, you might approach RPGs with caution, especially towards those that claim to be open world and offer total freedom to play your way, only to find out that the end result is a mashup of loading scenes and restricted areas that just feel empty. Personally, I'm the type of player who does the opposite of what I'm being told. I roleplay as myself, someone who's chaotic and bound by no laws. I simply do what feels natural in the moment, not by how a game ordains it. I don't want to be held back in any way, shape, or form. That's all there is to it. I absolutely loved exploring the fantastic worlds of Gothic, The Elder Scrolls, Baldur's Gate 3, and even Divinity Original Sin 2 for countless hours outside of the main quests, where I could truly play the way I wanted to. But all too often, it's just such a rare occurrence to come across games like this, because more times or not, they just don't align with my style. When a game expects me to follow a specific path, it becomes a challenge, and not the good kind. It's a problem because it restricts player freedom. And no matter how hard we try to break the game to play it our way, there are always elements that force us to back off and get back on the rails. I often worry about how much enjoyment I can truly get out of a game before certain features start to hinder the experience. I'm not somebody who wants to be stuck living the life of a powerless peasant, constantly following somebody else's agenda, and brutally punishing exploration. When a game introduces contradictions like a main character who supposedly can't swim but somehow manages to do so with an arrow lodged in their back through a cutscene, it just feels like blatant plot armor designed to cover up lazy development.
Bloody deep.
These inconsistencies pile up, creating a disconnect between the story's direction and what the player can actually do, which ultimately pulls you out of the experience and makes it harder to stay immersed in a world that isn't of your choosing. Avowed offers a sense of complete freedom, allowing you to explore and tackle objectives whenever and however you choose. For the most part, you're never locked into a location during a quest, except for maybe a couple of instances, and even then, there are rational reasons for it. What really sold me though is the immediate feeling of being left to your own devices. No hand-holding or forced restrictions on gameplay. You're free to discover and explore the world at your own pace, even if it is on the rails when it comes to story. The satisfaction of this freedom paired with the depth of the game makes it Obsidian Entertainment's best RPG to date, just slightly behind the legendary Fallout New Vegas. Before we dive into the heart of the game, let's address something that's on a lot of minds. I'll be as honest as I always am. I watched the trailer when I first heard about Avowed, and I was genuinely unimpressed. It's become all too common for publishers to push developers to release half-baked games as early access titles, only to get steamrolled by negative reviews because that version of the game offers next to nothing but the ability to play it sooner, so tensions are always high. I couldn't help but think to myself, this is what Ugly Sonic or the Cats musical would look like if they combined their visual elements with the world of Guardians of the Galaxy and mixed it together with some Skyrim gameplay. A lot of criticism seems to be directed at the Orlan race and of course also the Amawas. And I think I might understand why. Aora's hairy halflings really seem to test Obsidian's ability to develop and model 3D fur. I'm not sure if they were aiming for anthropomorphic animals or human-animal hybrids, but the end result is quite uncanny. Between the patterns, body fur, and facial hair, they look pretty hideous. Oddly enough, the splash art, especially for Yoghtsli, looks much better, with her form being far more appealing to look at, because it actually looks like it's natural. That said, I decided to give the game a fair shot despite my initial bias. I'm not going to dismiss a game just because of its appearance or the opinions of people who have only played for 10 minutes to an hour, claiming things that are just not true. Can you truly trust in someone who intentionally leaves a negative review for a game they've barely played, when their main goal is just to criticize it no matter what's actually in the game? It's always better to try a game for yourself before jumping to conclusions, because opinions are just that, opinions, and they may not align with your own. You never know, some opinions could be heavily influenced by developers passing bribes under the table to mold the responses from some of your favorite reviewers. If you judge a game purely on its appearance, you might overlook some hidden gems that deliver excellent gameplay and storytelling. Some games may look like slop, but they showcase the dedication of developers and voice actors alike who pour their hearts and souls into crafting compelling stories with deeply engaging gameplay. Games like this can ensure that you'll immerse yourself in more than just eye candy, helping you open your eyes to the world of endless possibilities, if you would just stop raising the bar so high. As competition intensifies and the bar is constantly raised, developers are increasingly likely to engage in tactics designed to maximize their profits. This includes hiking prices, offering less content, and using various stunts to extract more money from the players. And because these players are so high-strung about RPGs needing to offer over 100 hours of content, anything less than that is deemed unacceptable. This mentality overlooks the fact that quality is often superseded by quantity. A game with 40 hours of thoughtfully put together content can be far more rewarding than one that stretches on simply for the sake of extending that playtime. The most valid criticism here is that, yeah, it's not worth the asking price of $70. You're not paying for the game, you're paying for the Microsoft publishing brand. If pricing is your primary concern, wait for a sale or get it on the Game Pass. Nobody is forcing you to pick up the game at full price. No matter how much I look at this was one of my favorite RPGs on par with that of Baldur's Gate 3, Divinity Original Sin 2, Fallout New Vegas, and even the Elder Scrolls series. It's a far cry from the disasters that were Dragon Age Veilguard or Dragon's Dogma 2. This is a true RPG experience, offering more depth and basic features right out of the gate, but that doesn't mean it was without flaws. Over the years, Obsidian Entertainment has received a range of mixed reviews for some of their previous releases, like with Dungeon Siege 3 and even The Outer Worlds. Many players hoped that The Outer Worlds would have become the new Fallout New Vegas, but it didn't quite live up to those expectations, and the minority made their negative opinions overwhelmingly heard. But what game hasn't had this happen upon release in today's society? I think a lot of the backlash stemmed from The Outer Worlds being an Epic Game exclusive, something many players just don't take too kindly to. Developers often accept these cash grab deals as a quick way to make money, but it can definitely leave many with a bad taste in their mouth. Using Signy All Guns Blazing as an example, it was a complete failure on day one. And right after it launched on Steam, the very next day the developers took up Epic Games' offer. It went from a $30 game to a free game literally overnight. This creates a significant divide among gamers. On one hand, it's fantastic for players in third world countries who can never afford video games due to financial constraints that are costing them their livelihoods. On the other hand, it's also a disadvantage for Western audiences who still have to pay full price for the same game on a different platform. Thankfully, Avowed isn't an exclusive title. During my time with the Premium Edition's early access, I did encounter some persistent issues. There seemed to be a memory leak or something else causing the game to crash due to a fatal error every 3 to 4 hours exactly. While this was annoying, it wasn't a major setback because Avowed includes a feature that is often overlooked in many of these types of games, and that would be the use of autosaves. The game saves your progress regularly, across multiple files, meaning that the most you're ever going to lose is about 4 to 8 minutes of progression. You'll definitely want to take your time, especially with the bounties. I encountered a few bugs and hard locks related to the main quest and certain cutscenes within Dawnshore, such as respawning dead bounties and getting locked outside of the main story, particularly with the Apothecary. In some cases, you may have to redo upwards to 10 hours of gameplay. While this does sound frustrating, I was more than willing to endure it. This repetition in Dawnshore actually gave me a chance to experiment with different builds early on and to re-explore the world. It's highly recommended to use manual saves every few hours to minimize this kind of a risk of losing all of your progress. I'm not sure if this was because I was playing a high mobility build with maximum movement speed boosts, but there was one instance where the world just didn't fully load in. As soon as I fell through the world and died, the world reloaded and everything returned back to normal. While it was pretty hilarious, it didn't affect my progress, again thanks to the game's autosave feature. There are quite a few locations in this game that are accessible only by keys. Typically you have 3 options here. Help the NPC in the area to eventually be rewarded with this key, kill them for the quick access of this key, or find the key which is usually located nearby. The problem is, sometimes you'll go through a lot of the effort, whether it's wasting lockpicks or completing these side quests, only to find a breakable wall nearby, making it feel like you're a complete idiot who just wasted a lot of time on something that had so many different options to acquire so easily. Take for instance the house in the middle of the field in Emerald Stair. This house is locked, and while it can be picked with lockpicks, you'll notice there's a crack along the side, suggesting that it could be entered with explosives. If you continue down the road, you'll encounter an NPC with the key to this house. This is a common theme when exploring locked locations. There are often numerous ways in, but many of them feel unnecessary or wasteful, like the game was designed in such a way that it doesn't understand how to properly reward curiosity and instead hands everything away freely. Avowed isn't particularly a difficult game, nor does it feature sponge-like enemies. However, it might be frustrating to some due to the way progression works, especially when facing enemies that are currently beyond your character's current equipment quality and attributes. You can use weapons and gear that you find, craft, and purchase to help take down tougher enemies. But if you ever do come across better gear, like a powerful legendary weapon, your offhand weaker item could introduce a debuff to your outgoing damage. Equipping legendary gear alongside common quality gear will scale down the power and defenses of your legendary gear. To maximize your effectiveness, it's best to unequip older gear until you can replace or upgrade it with higher quality items. It seems many players overlooked this mechanic. The resources needed for upgrades are relatively scarce, particularly since you cannot farm enemies indefinitely. Once you've cleared an area and defeated the monsters, they will no longer respawn. This leaves you lacking in materials outside of gathering plants, disassembling unused equipment, and buying items from shops. Some may dislike this feature, but it kind of helps bring a bit more depth to the world that is becoming more empty due to your choices and also your violent habits. The The best way to gather materials is by using a perk like Scavenge while crafting them at the campsite with the 25% reduced cost of materials when upgrading your lower tier materials. I found the most efficient approach was to sell anything that I wasn't using while dismantling all of my high quality gear that I had acquired to get the necessary components. As somebody who tends to rush through locations, looting everything in sight, this didn't really bother me that much. I was always ready to dive back into the story after having tackled the harder content before even acquiring the proper gear or even the quests. The freedom to play like this is something that I've come to love and enjoy. If you've played Pillars of Eternity, you'll be pleased to know that Avowed is set in the same universe, taking place 2 years after the events of Deadfire. While it does feature a lot of similar elements, it is a standalone narrative that isn't directly tied to the previous story, making it accessible to all players, whether they are familiar with the earlier games or not. Contrary to popular belief, I didn't find the plot generic or dull. It could have been better, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Sure, it could have benefited from a more consistent flow from beginning to end, but it's far from the low quality writing we've seen in many other recent games. It's just such an unrealistic expectation to think that every RPG you play needs to match the caliber of Red Dead Redemption 2 or Baldur's Gate 3.
This group is full of weirdos!
Setting such a high bar will do nothing but prevent you from fully enjoying anything else that comes your way. The story begins with the player choosing their godlike character. A godlike is somebody who has been touched by a god and thus received a divine blessing. This is a blessing that not only grants them powers, but also marks them with unique physical features such as talons, growths, or horns, depending on which god has actually claimed them. Sent to the Living Lands as an envoy, the player encounters a land filled with challenges, different factions vying for power, gods lashing out in anger, and the chaos of politics. As the Emperor's personal messenger for the Adirian Empire, your mission is to forge alliances, exploring new trade routes to bring diplomacy to this disordered world, while putting an end to the threat of a dream scourge, a devastating plague that has prevented your entire empire from laying claim to this land as its own. The player has the freedom to choose, help conquer these lands, or to rise up against them with a rebellious spirit. It seems like people have mixed feelings about this. The issue often comes up with discussing the illusion of choice. Players want a game where choices lead to multiple branching paths that actually change the world around them. In Avowed, you do get to make choices, but these decisions usually result in an extra line of dialogue or a small stat check. While the story does offer different reactions based on this, it doesn't truly change the overall narrative. The story is going to stay largely the same, with small diversions here or there before everything comes back around. It's not a deal breaker for me because I still love the journey, but for others it may be a huge problem. Choices do influence how other characters respond to you in the later stages of the story.
No one will stand with you if you do this thing. What in Remagon's eight blasted hells are you thinking?
For example, if you help somebody along the way, they are much more likely to praise you and be more open to reason rather than forcing you into a confrontation. These shifts in dialogue are small as the story continues down its predetermined path. One example of this is when you're given the choice on how to respond to the gods. They can grant you special powers, or you can straight up reject them. The catch is, if you reject them, it means you're going to be missing out on some very interesting abilities that could have shaped more of your experience. After completing the entire game, I found the ending to be anticlimactic, though it did remind me of Fallout New Vegas and how it shows your decisions and all of their outcomes. I just couldn't shake the feeling that parts of the story might have been rushed or even cut out. It left me with a sense that something was always missing, considering how much of the world seemed available but ultimately went unused. I was left thinking that there could have been more. Presentationally, Avowed's menus and systems are simple and easy to grasp. The world itself is full of vibrant, persistent colors and life from a distance, thanks to the Unreal Engine 5 that displays a lot of the elements wondrously, except for one massive issue. Outside of combat and cutscenes, NPCs are lifeless, despite having great voice acting. When you visit towns or even sneak up on enemies, you would expect them to move around, talking and performing daily tasks. Instead, they are all standing still, oftentimes in static animations. NPCs will only move or react when provoked, or when they are the focus during the main scenes. This might have been an effort to stay true to the Pillars of Eternity style or the isometric top-down viewpoints found in this genre, but it raises concerns about immersion, when the world isn't truly alive. You have the option to play in either first person or third person. In third person, it often feels like your character is constantly sliding around, and the same can be said in first person, especially when you're being knocked over. It's something that could benefit from a bit more refinement. While the trailers for Avowed and marketing didn't win me over, the attention to detail and features that I didn't expect is what truly impressed me. For instance, the use of tongue movement when characters speak, eye contact with the player character, and changes in perspective that brought you face to face during intimate moments were subtle, but very effective touches. These little details help to make the game feel a bit more personal. The characters would be there for each other to tell stories and to bond over the campfire. Even if the world felt static with NPCs not doing much beyond idle chatter, these small interactions still felt very meaningful. As for character designs, while the Orlans and the Omawas may not appeal to everyone, their appearance fits within the world that they inhabit. It's not too bad, after all, your player character is just as grotesque as they are. While you can hide your character's markings if you want to thanks to the game's quality of life features, NPCs will still perceive you for what you truly are, a godlike being. In terms of diversity and customization options for the player characters, nothing really stood out as particularly impressive. The game offers an adequate range of choices, though it's worth noting that many of the hairstyles are reused persistently throughout the entire game. If you need to recruit specific characters for your group, it is a quick and painless process. All you need to do is recruit them at your camp. So long as you are not in a cave, you have the option to enter a camp and either return to the previous location or to leave where the camp was currently set up. I found this to be a great feature for added convenience that never slowed down the player. Brandon Keener's voice acting is, as always, exceptional. His ability to breathe life into a character regardless of their appearance is what truly makes him stand out. His portrayal of Kai in Avowed perfectly captured the essence of the character. He is a war-torn soldier who has endured tremendous loss but continues to fight for the greater good of all those around him.
Let's give her a hand.
It's reminiscent of his iconic role as Garrus Vakarian in Mass Effect. Every character in Avowed is a joy to listen to, and while Yatsley might take some time to warm up to, you'll find yourself bonding with her just as deeply as you would with Marius, Giata, and even Kai. One of the best aspects of Avowed is how you can play at your own pace. You can explore parts of the world that you missed, or venture into areas you technically shouldn't be in yet, without worrying about being prepared in terms of food, potion, armors, or weapons. I'm somebody who thrives on exploring vast and open worlds. The moment I'm given control, I head off the beaten path, eager to uncover all sorts of new things. If an RPG forces me to stick to the main story, it's a major red flag for me. Some may claim that you should shut up and play the game the way it was meant to be played. But to be an open world, our response to that would be,
go fuck yourself.
It often feels like a child being reprimanded for having a bold, curious outlook on the world, only to be locked away in a room and told to stay in line. Thankfully, Avowed doesn't do that. From the very start, I dove into exploration, finding enemies, NPCs, bounties, caves, secrets, powerful weapons, and even treasures. I spent 12 hours in Dawnshore alone, soaking it all in before I ran out of visual content to explore, and even then I still missed a bunch of locations before picking up the main story again. This was an incredibly enjoyable experience. In Avowed, you can truly play your way. If you prefer sticking to the main quest, picking things up as you go, that's entirely up to you. But if you want to veer off course and enjoy the game on your own, nothing is going to stop you, especially not invisible walls. Avowed's gameplay draws clear inspiration from a select few RPGs, with combat that feels reminiscent of Skyrim but on a larger visual scale, and story choices that mimic those found in the ending of Fallout New Vegas. What's notably absent are the many features that I've always enjoyed, like the ability to kill NPCs in towns, face consequences, or just go full chaos mode. Instead, you'll find yourself walking around and exploring, picking up an overwhelming amount of items and crafting materials from a lot of people and a lot of stalls without much of a thought. NPCs, for the most part, don't seem to care, letting you rifle through their belongings with little to no reaction, except for some rare occasions.
Darling, you are aware I can see you digging through my things, aren't you?
While I love having freedom in games, it feels like here there's just way too much of it, and it ends up being a big problem when you're overwhelmingly powerful with no meaningful consequences to keep you in check. The inclusion of tough choices would have added both depth and challenge. While there are moments where the game gets it right, in other areas it misses a mark, ultimately revealing that many of the choices you make are a little more than an illusion. These choices often lead to extra dialogue meant to build emotional bonds with your allies, but they do not have lasting impacts that you would hope to see. A lot of the dialogue does feel like it goes nowhere important. Obsidian Entertainment clearly put in a lot of effort into optimizing a wide array of quality of life features, but in some ways, they may have gone a bit too far. They've stripped away elements like unnecessary backtracking and class restrictions, which often hinders a player's progression or creative freedom. Don't like the build you or your allies currently have? No problem, just change it for a small cost of gold that scales with your level. Want to max out or rearrange some of your attributes or blend different roles? It's as simple as clicking a button. As you experiment with the different builds and eventually settle on one that feels right for you, keep in mind that the story centers around the player being blessed by a god. This blessing makes these unrestricted features thematically fitting, like for example, never having to worry about becoming over-encumbered because you have the ability to stash equipment for later disassembly or selling from the menu. For my part, I eventually landed on a fast, high-mobility dual-wield sword and longbow build that allowed me to stack status effects quickly and to deal with both bosses and grouped enemies with ease. But that isn't to say that I stuck with one playstyle throughout my entire time here in Aora. I switched around things many times, from pistols, daggers, greatswords, and different abilities until I settled on my favorite. Wondering what kind of builds are available within? Well, there are plenty to choose from. Magic is very interesting to mess around with, and the interactions with weapons in the world around you can sometimes surprise you. You might fancy a Necromancer playstyle. Even if the AI isn't all that helpful, including your allies, the choice is there for you to experiment with. For some, this is where the gameplay truly shines, while others may feel that it quickly stagnates due to the repetitive nature of the enemy encounters. It's hard to argue with that. Fighting the same enemies over and over can get quite tiresome, especially if they are triple skulled. Abusing the enemy's aggro range with long-range weapons felt like it diminished the overall experience. It felt cheap and made the gameplay feel a bit overlooked in this regard, as enemies would run back and forth within their aggro, which did disrupt the flow of combat. On top of that, the absence of the arrows and ammunition for every ranged weapon meant that there was no need to worry about this kind of exploitation. It didn't really bother me because I can proudly state that regardless of what was happening, I was always able to just sit back and have some fun. I enjoyed hacking and slashing through the game, as I watched enemies and allies alike fly through the air in their exaggerated ragdoll fashion. It was both satisfying and very humorous, driving me forward to experience more of these chaotic, action-packed moments. Eventually, the world began to feel hollow and lifeless, a consequence of my insatiable thirst for violence. Once again, the most striking part about this is once enemies die, they will never respawn. An intriguing feature for some, but potentially a problem for others who may miss that constant challenge or diversion. It made Aora feel like a gradually dying world, a shell of its former self, which felt like decent world building based on the player's involvement. Despite my initial doubts and concerns that the game would fall short due to what was being showcased, I ended up having a surprising amount of fun. It managed to engage me without being a burden with broken promises or offering a low-quality release that is all too common these days. When I state that I had a lot of fun, I don't claim that lightly. I play upwards to 400 to 500 different games and genres every year, so my opinions are a lot more expanded upon, due to variety making it exceptionally hard to really click with a lot of titles, whereas the average player spends their years playing the same 5 games and the occasional splurge on a new AAA title that absolutely blows them out of the water. Every minute of my 45-hour journey across Aora was pleasant even with the flaws. While I do wish there was more content and that some aspects could have been fleshed out to make it stand out even more, the game just doesn't provide enough content to justify its high price tag. This is what happens when you work with publishers like Microsoft and other big-name brands. My recommendation would be to access it via the Game Pass for a reasonable price and then decide whether if it's worth continuing or if you would rather move on to something else. Doing this is going to save you a lot of money yearly. My biggest hope is that the modding community can get their hands deep into the core of the game's problems and really flesh it out more, offering more content and diversity, especially with the magic system, because I'm really interested to see what people can come up with. And just to help bring the world to a state that feels more alive and less shallow at times, that's really all that was missing. In the meantime, if you're still on the fence of whether you want to pick it up or not, I'll be hosting 3 separate giveaways for 3 separate chances at 1 Steam copy of Avowed worldwide, which Obsidian Entertainment has kindly provided for me to give to you. The giveaways end on the 28th of February, and you can find all the details linked in the description below. As always, I really appreciate your support. It truly means a lot to me to be able to provide these opportunities for you, the viewer, no matter where you find yourself in life, and I do hope to continue seeing you in future reviews.